Champions of Psychology is meant as education and entertainment. It is not a substitute for medical advice or professional counseling. Discussion of mental health topics will be primarily rooted in research and the personal experiences and self-disclosures of the hosts. While we can provide generalized education and possible mental health resources, we cannot offer any recommendations, advice, or opinions for any specific persons, cases, or situations. We provide these resources and links at our sole discretion, but have not necessarily vetted or reviewed any resource. We assume no liability for the use of the information or resources on these sites, and we encourage you to use your own best judgment.
Hello, and welcome to Champions Psychology, a show with the goal of openly talking about mental health and gaming, presented by Codename Entertainment and TakeThis.org. Every Tuesday at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time here on twitch.tv/CNE Games, Mitra Jordan and Raffael Boccamazzo, aka Dr. B, talk about mental health and how gaming affects us. If you're with us live in the chat, you can leave a question that I, Treavor Bettis, will ask them later in the show. Our topic today is radical acceptance, but before we get to that, who are you two for the fine folks who may not know?
I'm Mitra Jordan. I'm a registered clinical counselor in Victoria, BC. I work with, obviously losing my voice for some reason. I work with adults, youth, and couples, and acceptance in order to change is definitely a significant part of our ability to change. So I'm not going to say anything about my bouncy bow-tied friend here.
Bouncy bow-tied friend.
Yeah, well, I'm here. Hi, everybody. I'm Orville Redenbacher and Geralt of Rivia's love child. I come here today to bring you popcorn tidings. I'm Dr. Raffael Boccamazzo, Dr. B for long Italian name reasons. I'm the clinical director at the oldest mental health nonprofit in games, Take This. Make sure to check out all of our resources over there at takethis.org. I'm also a clinical psychologist in Washington State, and I am I'm an expert on the applied use of games, especially TTRPGs in clinical and learning settings. And I love talking about this stuff because, you know, acceptance and change just go hand in hand.
Yeah.
So yeah, we should talk about this stuff.
Well, let's get into talking about it then.
Well, okay, yeah. So what's the problem?
Yeah.
Because I mean, we're talking about radical acceptance and why coping with change. Why is change hard? Because change is hard.
Like when I hear radical acceptance, it makes me think of two things. Either it's that
I swear to God, if you bring up amphibians,
it's that I'm accepting something extremely quickly, or I'm accepting something that's totally awesome, dude.
Okay, good.
It's the trouble is it sounds like such a buzzword, and in fact the trouble is it kind of became a buzzword, and I really take issue with that. But anyway,
no, well, I mean it is. It's every time there's something that has it. There are these trends in psychology where we have something and we see effectiveness for it, and effectiveness for it, and then it just gets commercialized and recycled and utilized to the point that it becomes pop culture, becomes pop psychology, and we also have no bloody clue what it actually means in its original form.
Exactly. So I'm going to share, I'm not part of a Zendo or Sangha right now, but I was an active member of a Zen community for many years. I practiced, I even took householder vows. And so I'm really familiar with Buddhist thinking. And I also did a lot of research on Buddhism, psychology, how it's interpreted in the West, what we get wrong, what we're missing in terms of the fuller picture. Because of course, Buddhism came from long traditions of religion, notably Hinduism, and so they were traditions that developed in a particular culture that is very different than Western culture and Western ecumenical traditions. So
all that is Catholic in me just protested in Latin.
Right. And so there's a meditation practice to pretty much every religion, first of all, right? But the meditation practice is seen as having different purposes depending on the religion. But more broadly speaking, there's a similarity rather than a difference. However, if we look at Catholicism and even Protestantism, if we look at the way Christian interpretations are of sin or wrongdoing or challenges in terms of what strays us from the path, the idea often is to rise above in some way. And this is known as spiritual bypassing, and it occurs not just in Christianity. I am not trying to call anyone out. The reason I mention it, go on.
I just have a question.
Sir?
Why are we talking about this on a psychology show?
Yeah, we're not getting into religion so much as we're wanting to understand where certain traditions come from.
Like, why? I think how is this used in psychology?
Okay, let's get to that. So we have commodified two terms that were at one point related to a specific religion: mindfulness, right? And then radical acceptance is a Western term for an Eastern concept. We are talking about this because when we do this, we're like, okay, but what does it mean? And we take an idea that was much more broadly related and deeply rooted in a different tradition. And in how we interpret and have used it, we have psychologized these terms, if you will.
I love the verb.
Right?
I love the verb.
I came up with that. It's thing. So we kind of made them into a thing that we use in order to help promote people's psychological health. So mindfulness really is about being in the present moment, staying present to your experience. And there are specific steps in terms of exercises, if you will, activities, ways of being. We can meditate, for example. There is a walking meditation tradition, for instance, in Eastern, in Buddhist practice, particularly Zen, and in Tibetan as well, actually. And the idea is that you walk slowly and very mindfully in order to enhance this aspect of this behavior around being mindful of your every step, your awareness of what's around you. And we can bring that notion of mindfulness into other practices. So, for instance, people talk about mindful eating or just kind of being present to the moment. Now, this is relevant to the idea of radical acceptance, right? In that, I really hate the word radical here. I get really kind of hung up on the use of language, because there's nothing radical about acceptance in the sense that if we want to know or understand how to change, we have to be able to accept our baseline, where we are at in this moment, right? So we have to be able to do that, and here's the radical piece, without judgment or shame. And so somehow this idea became radical. But I think part of the problem for me with this term is because often the idea of non-attachment is thrown in there. And non-attachment is often attached to Zen Buddhism. You like my use of the word attachment there? But the idea is that in order to move through things, we can't get stuck. Therefore, we shouldn't get too attached, say, to an outcome. You know how I wanted a thing and it was supposed to go this way, but it went that way instead, and I'm really upset about it. And that is attachment. That is where we got stuck on a desired outcome that didn't happen. Or we got stuck because we're grieving something. And that grief is normal, but if we tell ourselves, I should be over it, I should be through this, I should be better than this, these are all ways in which we're trying to rise above or transcend. And the problem with that is we're not actually dealing with what's underneath. And often in concepts of Buddhism, particularly Zen Buddhism in I'd say popular culture, is this idea of inner peace. That's not what meditation or acceptance is about at all. It's not about, I'm going to rise above, I'm going to meditate, I'm going to be in this great altered atmosphere, and then I'll be able to cope. It is what it is. And however you say and whatever you do, it's okay. And this is where it's reminiscent of the idea of forgive and turn the other cheek, which are wonderful concepts. But forgiveness is a process, for example. Moving through a place where things genuinely don't bother you isn't about an active, I'm just going to push this away and rise above sort of thing. It's about the process of being angry, of being sad, of being regretful, of really feeling upset, of being ashamed, and moving through those emotions. So radical acceptance is supposed to be about that, not the subverting or the rising above. And that, I think, is the main issue with how it's often thought of or experienced. So, long speech.
No, that was good.
Long speech.
What what does this have to do with change? Because I mean, we're also talking about coping with change, and radical acceptance was brought into Western psychology in the 1980s through dialectical behavioral therapy and a bunch of other stuff. Won't get into all that, but over the last 4 decades, it's just become this ubiquitous concept that's often thrown in to mental health practices when it comes to not just change, but resilience. And from your perspective, Mitra, where does it intersect with the concept of change and the difficulties with change? We've talked about that. Change sucks.
Yep.
Yeah.
Change is awful because it takes work. It requires us coping with uncertainty. It requires us coping with the anxiety. It requires us coping with ambiguity because, that old phrase, better the demon we know. Right. There's a certain comfort in familiarity and complacency in the status quo. And radical acceptance is often therapeutically talked about in the same vein as personal change.
Beautifully said. Absolutely. And so let's think about this. I'm going to say a statement we've all heard. Today is the first day of the rest of your life.
See, I went someplace really differently as soon as you said today. And if this was word association, I was going to be like, today is a good day to die. Kapla.
That has a lot to do with change, I guess. But yes. Okay. So I think that this idea of all or nothing thinking, which is very related to cognitive behavioral therapy and even to dialectical behavioral therapy, right, is okay, if I've made a decision that I'm going to do this change thing, I am all in. Now,
I would appreciate you not calling December 31st Dr. B out like this. January 7th Dr. B is already angry.
Yes, it's beautiful. January 15th, Mitra is pretty pissed too, by the way. So.
But okay, so since we've called
the darkness has fully set in.
since you've already called me out, that December 31st, Dr. B is saying, I'm all in. Today is the first day of the next year. No, wait, that's tomorrow. Either way, let's do this.
Yeah. Yeah. So the problem with let's do this is like, okay, good, full steam ahead, damn the torpedoes, and you're off. And none of this takes into account all of the slip-ups, all of the challenges, all of how day 35 of, I'm not having a cigarette is going to feel. Actually, day 35 might not be that bad. I would argue probably day 7 is pretty crappy. But what I'm talking about is whenever we try to change something, we have to accept, first of all, how we are really feeling about that change. And so if I say, yeah, full steam ahead, I'm on my diet, it's going to be great, and then, 3 days in and I'm like, God, I really crave that ice cream or whatever. I have to acknowledge I'm craving that ice cream. I have to acknowledge that this is hard. I have to think about, how am I going to do this in a sustainable way? And is sustainable for me, there's no ice cream in the house? Or is sustainable for me, I'm going to have a quarter cup and eat it mindfully, like really enjoy every bite.
Yeah.
Right. So each of us has to kind of figure out the how of change. We might be quite clear on the why of change. We might be quite clear on a commitment to that idea, but we haven't perhaps had the experience of really dealing with that choice. Or we've had that experience many times, and at some point we've had to throw in the towel. And I say had to because I don't think anyone wants to just throw in the towel. I think people very sincerely set off on change journeys, and they discover either the change isn't quite right for them, this isn't the direction they wanted to go in, or they haven't fully taken their life context into account and how hard it might be.
That one right there.
Yeah.
Like, when I've talked about this before, that my wife and I did the Whole30 in it was like 2017 or something like that. And I knew I had ADHD, but again, didn't know what that meant. And we didn't know that my wife had ADHD. And like thinking back on it now, like just two of us being like, oh yeah, we'll do the Whole30. Like just, oh my God. Like there was like no preparation or anything for it. Just like, oh, we just won't have anything bad in the house. We'll just get good stuff. And I remember one of the things that I was so mad about towards the end of that month was, I'm like, it's not even the craving of bad food. I just hate having to think about every one of my meals so far ahead of time. And that was ADHD 100%. I'm just like, I just want to be able to go home, play some games, and then go, I guess I'll eat something. Because that's just ADHD comfort, I guess. Well,
but you're also, I mean, you're hitting on this, on what, what Mitra said so nicely, and that's about thinking about, our limitations, our strengths, basically the environment and system around us. And so much, at least admittedly, my understanding of the way radical acceptance was incorporated, into psychology from its original spiritual tradition is where we need to be looking at this complete. I mean, that's why they use the term radical, because it's all encompassing, it's ubiquitous, it's omnipresent. This idea that we need to be looking at the totality of our situation, which includes our strengths, our challenges, our situation, the limitations, and the fact that sometimes these goals and these changes don't actually align with what we truly want.
Yeah.
And the fact that we have setbacks. It's not that all or nothing, success or not, abstinence relapse model.
Yeah, I think because that's so punishing, and that is absolutely one of the problems that we encounter is the sort of restriction and shame that sometimes goes along with changes we might want to make in our lives. Because as soon as we restrict, we want the thing we've restricted. Whether it's good for us, bad for us, however we label it. And I really take issue with the idea of bad foods or whatever. Sure, there are some, they're all coping tools, and some of them aren't ideal. And some of them have been very damaging to people.
Yeah. I was like, you've never had lutefisk, have you?
I thought about that burger I saw over the weekend.
Suddenly, we're going to get angry letters from the Scandinavian contingency on this. Just like, dear Dr. B, I am a lutefisk fan. And good on you if you are.
I did want to note that we did want to start moving towards what do we do about this at this point.
Yeah.
So what do we do about this?
So what do we do about it? So first of all, I think, unlike one thing about the Whole30 that I really dislike is the idea that if you slip up, you have to start over.
Oh,
right.
God.
And I just think
punishing.
that is so punishing. So the first thing we do is not be punishing. Part of acceptance is developing a genuine compassion for our own experience. And I've said this many times before, which is the internal self-talk that we often have towards ourselves. I say self-talk towards ourselves, silly me, but there's judgment in there, right? So our challenges are that if a friend came to us and was struggling with something, we'd probably be quite kind. I hope we'd be kind. If you're not kind, go deal with that.
But depends on the friend.
You need to go further back into the show and start at the beginning.
I really enjoy your bow tie habit, Dr. B. So be kind. Actually, I do enjoy his boat. I have it. This isn't a sarcastic remark, although, I just felt the need to clarify.
Mm-hmm.
But be kind to others. You often are. It's your self-talk that's the issue. I've talked to many people about self-talk, of course, over the years, and routinely I'll hear, for some reason, in some way, oh yes, but it's okay to talk to me like that. Like, we make exceptions in terms of unkindness when we're talking about our own processes.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, we are listening to us, and our own self-talk really affects our sense of trust and our capacity for change. Because, if I'm like, drop and give me 50 maggots or whatever, I'm not doing myself any favors. No, seriously.
One.
I love that there was groaning before one.
Ah!
That was
Before
my
the
favorite
first
part.
one.
Yeah.
You look good. You look swell.
I can't
You
go
look
further
swell.
than that until my physical therapist says I can.
What do you mean you can't do 50? You see? So there's that drill sergeant side of the self that we really
I
have to
could
pull out.
before all the injuries.
And we need to take in our own personal context of what we're able to do and accept that context is our current reality. How are you doing with that?
I'm annoyed with it. Well, and this is, I mean, just to throw myself out there into this, it's something I find myself frustrated with on a day-to-day basis because, I used to be a lot more active, and then due to some, I won't get into the details of which, but I've had a series of almost hilariously gnarly injuries in the last 6.5 months, which has completely curtailed my ability to be active in any way, shape, or form, given the sheer number of things I've injured. And this is something that has been brought to my attention on more than one occasion, or I've tried to apply it in terms of self-acceptance and self-compassion and so forth. But it is so hard because I want to be where I want to be. And I want to be there now, Mitra.
I know, and the training montage never did anyone any favors.
It
Like,
did
I think the way
when
pop
it's in a
culture
movie.
and the before and after, like, I don't think we focus enough on the in the middle bits where we're in a lot of pain, or like I actually have to do my physiotherapy exercises, and I'm very bad about it because they hurt. And I think this is a piece around change work that we really do need to talk about. How do we accept being in pain? How is our pain tolerance? And this isn't like, yeah, I'm going to power through. I think we have to be gentle with ourselves. First of all, don't push past your own pain tolerance. Really pay attention
You
to
say
your
funny
own
words,
margins.
Earth person.
I have been told
You
this
say
before.
strange things.
So, accepting situations outside your control without judgment is also particularly tough when we're talking about our own actions and our bodies.
Well,
and
question
our
there.
past.
So one of the
You in the bow tie.
Yes, thank you. Roy Trent Krim, independent.
I like the old Trent Krim.
But
it's such a fantastic show. Please go on.
I still haven't seen the rest of season 3. But the one of the things that comes up frequently when I talk about this with folks in my therapy practice is the subtle difference between evaluation and judgment. Like, we talk, like, the way we colloquially within a Western context talk about being judgmental, it means a lot of different things. And one of the ways that, this sort of acceptance is utilized is, psychologically speaking, is in an evaluative fashion. But a lot of the folks I work with struggle with the difference between judgment and non-judgmental evaluation.
Hugely.
So, I mean, like, what do you see as the difference?
I see the difference as if we can non-judgmentally evaluate. We're talking about where someone is at, limitations, strengths, without bringing in that emotional judgment piece, and it is really difficult. So, for example, some of the most difficult kinds of evaluation around this is around parenting. When I'm talking to parents and we're talking about how they evaluate themselves or how they could improve in their parenting capacity, you can quickly see how this could go down a really tough road, right? Even tougher than my own behavior with eating or diet or whatever, right? But in both instances, the piece that's really close to the surface there is shame and mortification. And so if you're evaluating yourself, start to look out for that. Where are you starting to make yourself feel smaller? And when I say make yourself, I mean, yeah, while other people can't make us anything so much,
technically,
but other people's, obviously their judgment has a huge impact on us. But we are also certainly able to make ourselves feel worse or just accept what's there. But it's really difficult. It takes practice. It's not something we're good at. We're good at being either praised or judged. And what we don't always think about is praise is a form of judgment that can put a lot of pressure on us as well. So when we're talking about evaluating without judgment, we're also talking about not praising. We don't want to self-aggrandize and we don't want to self-minimize.
Well, then it comes back to this comes back to my question, and these are questions I get a lot from my clients. What's the difference between, self-aggrandizement versus recognition? Because I think I think there's a big difference between us being able to honestly and non-judgmentally recognize our strengths and our challenges. Like, I mean, we're all very casual about being very ADHD. And I don't think we're doing that in a judgmental way. That's just a fact. And we have challenges around that.
Right. So let's give an example from physio for a second. It's much easier to not have a judgment about things that we aren't super attached to, right? But that's actually a great starting base. So I started to have a lot of trouble with my grip, both in my left and right hands, but particularly my right hand. Cleaning up, there's a sponge, I would squeeze it and go at the counter. I couldn't do that. It was terrifying. I was terrified. What the hell? What's happening here? And now my grip is back and it's really great. And yeah, I still need to do my physio exercises to keep it that way. But it was really good to know there was something I could do to change the situation, right? So that's a really easy example. Change is possible. I went ahead and did it. Now, if the outcome was different and my grip issues were, say, due to some form of arthritis or something that I couldn't change, that's a lot harder to deal with. And it's outside my control. And that's really tough. If the grip issue was something that I had created because of carelessness, or something where maybe I noticed there was a problem, but I didn't take care of it. Now we're a year later and there's nothing I can do to change it, or so it seems. There can be so much shame and self-recrimination around that. Why didn't I take care of it? Why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do that, right? And that's some of the negative self-talk we're talking about. But that doesn't help with the evaluation of the situation and finding other supports to make life livable and wonderful, and where we're not so hung up on the one thing we can't do, right? So it's that process of being able to evaluate without judging ourselves that's important. And the challenge is, if we grew up with a lot of judgment, it becomes really, there's more layers to peel away here before we can just see us and the thing that we're judging or worried about. People often fear self-aggrandizing themselves because they think they're being too dramatic or too big for their britches. And these are messages they may have received as a child. I got an A in the test. Great. Why wasn't it an A+? Or don't rest on your laurels. Or what about tomorrow's test? How are you going to do for that one? Right?
Well, can I throw something out there for this? Like, yeah. I mean, obviously getting a failing grade versus the perfect grade, that's a big difference. But one of the, we talked about this in terms of this either or, all or nothing mentality. And I'm seeing some of the comments in chat, and it's reflective of some of the questions I get in my practice when I work with folks. And that is like, how do you recognize that you've done good enough, and even have contentment in that, versus with the fact that of course you can do better, of course you can continually improve. I mean, one of the biggest confusion points I get for people when we talk about change and acceptance is the idea that satisfaction is often or contentment is often conflated with complacency. That if I'm happy with where I'm at, I will not want anything.
Yeah, and it's usually the opposite. I've achieved a goal and I'm happy, and it can give me the space to think about other things.
Right.
You know, but it's true. I think that's really well said. I think that's exactly the conflation between being satisfied and feeling like it's enough. We're often told it's not enough. I think particularly in late stage capitalism, there's always something else you can do or commodify.
Because infinite growth is totally sustainable. Woo!
And it's not in ourselves either. Exactly. You know, when my kids were young, there was this buzz phrase, I guess, that was going around that was actually really great. And it was the good enough parent.
Mm-hmm. I remember.
Nobody is perfect. Yeah. And I think it's so important to recognize the good enough, because it allows you to be much more balanced as a human and have other things in your life. And also not panic about things, right? Because otherwise if we're fixated on being better at one thing, I assure you there's something else we're also not able to look at. There are only 24 hours in a day after all, right? So
with that attitude.
Yeah, I have that attitude. I don't work hard and play hard. I do medium. I have ADHD. What do you want from me?
I don't need your stinking thinking and your limitations of physics.
Right, because you're exceptional. Right. And I think you're saying this so well. That is the problem. It's like, no, that shouldn't apply to me. I should somehow be better than that, more than that. I should transcend that. I worry about that word.
Right.
Exactly. So
I should transcend space and time and physical limitations.
Yes, that's right.
Where's Thanos?
I have words with him.
Oh Lord.
I sent him away though, if only. For today.
So we do have one question that I want to get to, but we do have the how do we do it? Like with what do we how do we do this?
I mean, that's always the challenging part, isn't it? Like, how do we find contentment and even joy? Who's really there are some folks who are incredible at talking about finding joy even in the midst of suffering and oppression and systemic obstacles. I know my friend and colleague Cassie Walker, who's been on the show. They do their mental woke on Twitter. They do some wonderful work around finding joy in their trainings and with clients. But one of the classic examples that every psych student knows is the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. If you don't know the story behind that book, Viktor Frankl was a Viennese psychiatrist who came up with this concept of logotherapy, essentially finding meaning even in the midst of suffering, while he was being moved around different Nazi concentration camps in World War II. And it's the first 2/3 of that book are all personal story, and it's powerful.
So I have a few resources from Buddhist traditions. My favorite is, one of my favorites is this book here, which is called Waking Up to What You Do. It's been around for ages. It's by a woman called Diane Eshin Risetto, which I was trying to add to the chat, but then something happened here. And never mind. Not having a moment. So Risetto is Rizzetto, and she talks about and Pimo Chodron is good too. That's P as in Peter, E-M-A, and Chodron. And she's a Tibetan. She was a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner. And what they talk about is how to deal with really dire or difficult situations. In one case, it was the ending of a marriage. In the other, it's more broadly about how we cope with our own behavior and our own thoughts without projecting them on other people, which is a key part of good change, right? Because if we're busy comparing, if we're busy feeling small, if everything we do isn't okay, that's the stinking thinking right there. If
I hate
and
that
you know,
phrase so much.
I hate that phrase so much. Yes, but it's because it doesn't help anyone, and it's very normal to have those kinds of thoughts.
Well, and it also it in and of itself, it's a judgmental term about our thought processes. When so much of the work I do with people, and this is my bias, is to think about how helpful is that thought versus is it good or bad? Because we don't have good or bad emotions. We certainly got some of us, especially with anxiety disorders, have overactive emotions that do more than they should.
I think
Wouldn't know anything about that.
None. I've never had that happen to me. Have I ever lost? No. So the idea of having to be in control is another one which is problematic, right? Because we're not always going to be in control. In fact, being in control is preparing for when we're not in control. It's like a parent going, yeah, kid's going to have a 2-year-old's going to have a fit if, they're tired, they're hungry. I take them to the grocery store at the wrong time. We're in a toy store where it's overwhelming and there's too many people. You bet something's going to go wrong. How can we be kind to ourselves in that way? How can we recognize where we're likely to trip up? It's only by observing when we do trip up. And being aware of what those trip ups are. So there is this concept in Buddhism called Shenpa, or the hook. And it's about where we get hooked. And we can get hooked on things we really want. We can get hooked on specific outcomes. We can go to a job interview and get hooked on really getting that job, or go see an apartment and really get hooked on that. And when those things don't happen, we can get really upset, and we can start to self-recriminate and blame ourselves so much for why this didn't happen. If I did this next time, if I did that, why did I say that stupid thing in the interview? And it may have nothing to do with us. So part of that acceptance more broadly is recognizing things won't always work, and we shouldn't always attribute it to ourselves, but we also shouldn't always attribute it to someone else. The interviewer was a jerk. That apartment building, they want someone who could probably afford to buy the building, never mind just live in it. We can tell ourselves lots of stories. None of these actually help us deal with the acceptance of the situation or ourselves. They're okay to do for a while, and they point to what our thought process is. They're important to look at, but they shouldn't run our show. We don't have to believe everything we think.
Well, you're also reminding me of, to get a little technical with folks, there is a school of thought in psychology. There's a school of thought in psychology, existential psychology, that the greatest goal in existential psychology is to accept and live with what they call existential anxiety, but basically the things we actually can't control. Because to existential psychologists, neuroses, pathology comes from trying to control the things that we don't control, creating what they call neurotic anxiety versus existential anxiety. But we're getting really technical there. But what it means is that there's this middle path of doing what you can and then letting the rest go, kind of like in archery. You line up your shot as best you can, but the instant you let go of the arrow, it does what it does. And there can be things outside of your control that interfere with that. And that seems to be a lot of where this stuff is, of at least as I utilize it in my practice, of examining things, evaluating things without personal judgment, and basically saying, okay, what can we do with this?
Are you both okay with taking a question before we start wrapping
Yeah.
things up?
Well, let's take
Sure.
questions. Yes.
Questions.
We got one question. This comes from Reaver01. He says, question, does embracing radical acceptance in its totality helpful in overcoming the internalized fear of potentially losing what one sees as an important aspect of self during change?
I mean, what's our motto around these
We
parts?
don't have our sweatshirts and shirts yet, so
I know they're almost. Mine's almost
I know,
here.
it's on its way.
Me too.
Also,
Me
as
too.
a heads up for anyone out there that signed up, your newsletters with your codes are in the works. That is totally my fault. They'll get sent out to you soon.
But I mean, what's our motto around here? It depends. Always depends. And sure, I mean, I just speaking for myself personally in my professional practice, everybody has different needs. Everybody has different reasons for doing the things that they do or not doing the things that they do. And so there isn't a one size fits all answer. Otherwise, I would have no student debt and I would be peddling that. And I would be like double diamond club elite level sales on that, whatever that answer is. So
I think,
maybe.
go on. Yeah, I think one thing to look out for is like this idea of accepting everything in its totality doesn't necessarily mean that you're not also embracing change.
Mm-hmm.
Because in order to change, we have to accept both the things that benefit us, the things that hold us up, and the circumstances that might slow the process down, or speed it up in ways we didn't expect, right? And so there's the it depends part. That like I mentioned with the hook thing, yeah, what kinds of hooks us can also stop us.
Right.
And so we just really need to be aware of what choices we're making. What are we choosing to give up if we're changing? What are we going to add back into our lives? Because we can get hooked or stuck on the things that we're giving up or that we think we should give up. And so for our own situation, when we're thinking about change, we need to figure out what's going to be tolerable in terms of the change process. And to do that, we do actually have to accept the situation, whatever that may be.
And part of the acceptance, and one of the biggest hurdles I run into with folks on this is this idea that acceptance is the same thing as resignation. And it's base, or in putting it another way, accepting where I am means giving up on hope that I can change things. And that's not what this is. It, accepting things in their totality also means, yes, accepting where you are, and also accepting the potentiality of where you can go.
Yeah.
And what you can do.
I'm going to add, it is also accepting how you feel about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Like I'm with, it's true that we kind of have to see what's actually there, but that doesn't mean we can't feel grief about it or sadness or fury and it's really important to examine those feelings because they will become that hook we're talking about if you don't process them.
Well, and you talked about this a little bit early in the show, and definitely talked about it in our pre-production meeting yesterday, is this idea, and, to use a really culturally commodified and culturally appropriated term of, I need to be so zen about this.
Yeah.
But what people often mean by that is basically a form of denial.
Yes.
And that's not what we're talking about.
No. So there's a term for that. And often when we talk about commodifying yoga and Buddhism and all this, so it has sort of this spiritual piece to it. It's called spiritual bypassing. But in general, bypassing or trying to kind of rise above or ignore parts of our own experience, isn't helpful. Sometimes it makes sense to say, well, it's out of my control. When the pandemic was, I can control my response to it, but the actual event wasn't in my control, right?
Right.
That's realistic to understand and to know. But when we're talking about what you're saying, this bypassing this idea of sort of rising above, or kind of like, you know, it becomes a problem because we haven't actually dealt with those feelings. We're not actually Zen about it. We're trying to mask and behave a certain way. And we can keep that up for a time. We can not respond with the whatever. We can kind of control how we behave in certain environments, but can't live like that.
So what you're saying is chronic denial is bad? And you're saying that chronic avoidance of feelings is bad?
I mean,
like, there's a difference.
Okay.
There's a difference between saying, you know what, I need to kind of put this aside for right now so I can get through the next hour, but I'll deal with it later, versus la 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 la, I am above this.
You've encapsulated it brilliantly.
All right. Well, we have to start wrapping things up, and I think that's a good place to do so. Friends, if people want to find you and what you do on the interwebs, where could they do so?
People can find me at Mitra Jordan on Twitter and mitrajordan.com on my website. And Dr. Boccamazzo is... Yes.
I'm around.
Yeah, you turn over a stone on the internet, there's Dr. B.
Yeah, kind of like a millipede. There I am.
No, we're really fortunate that you're around.
You can find me on pretty much all the socials at the Dr. B. That's TheeDoctorB as in boy. But more importantly, follow TakeThis.org. You can stay up to date on all the fun stuff we're working on, all the free resources we have on our website that are created by other mental health professionals and advocates that are pretty high quality, I think. I'm biased, but I don't think I'm wrong.
You're biased, but you're also objective. You're not.
You're biased.
I try to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can find
Thank
me
you
on
for
Twitter.
joining us.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at the Treavor. There's an A hiding in there. And yeah, that's gonna do it for this week's episode. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to Mars and Jordan for doing an amazing job of moderating in the chat while we were going. And thank you to Codename and Take This for giving us an opportunity to have these discussions. I think the schedule is normal. I don't know what normal is anymore because I don't handle that stuff. But
what 2/3 of people would do in a given situation.
Dang.
Yeah, there we go. The norm.
We'll
be here next
for the
week.
rest of the day. But yeah. Oh yeah, we're gonna have. Are we taking other weeks off soon? I can't remember anymore. Are we?
Well, we're gonna have some updates to the schedule because there various work trips happened.
Yes. So just keep an eye out on our on the All Champions Twitter and Discord and Reddit, and you'll be caught up to date on what's going on. But that's gonna do it for this week's episode. So until next week, take care of yourself. I also just realized I didn't have the button up for me to actually do that. So now we're gonna
bye everybody.
Champions of Psychology is meant as education and entertainment. It is not a substitute for medical advice or professional counseling. Discussion of mental health topics will be primarily rooted in research and the personal experiences and self-disclosures of the hosts. While we can provide generalized education and possible mental health resources, we cannot offer any recommendations, advice, or opinions for any specific persons, cases, or situations. We provide these resources and links at our sole discretion, but have not necessarily vetted or reviewed any resource. We assume no liability for the use of the information or resources on these sites, and we encourage you to use your own best judgment.